Okay. Okay. I think we're ready to go, so I'll turn it over to Manuel. So for the introduction. Okay.
All right. All right. Thank you again, Jose, for being with us and presenting today. Um, today's presentation is the Inquisition and 17th century New Mexico genealogy. Jose Antonio Isquivel is a genealogical researcher, historian, and author of articles and books related to New Mexico Spanish colonial era history. He is co-author of Juan Dominguez de Mendoza, Soldiers and Frontiersmen of the Spanish Southwest, 1627-1693. In 2009, Juan Carlos II, King of Spain, admitted Jose Antonio to the knightly Orden de Isabel de los Católicos for his dedication to uncovering and preserving the history of Spain and Spanish heritage in New Mexico. This presentation will examine the history of the Inquisition in New Mexico during the 1600s and its influential role in New Mexico society and the preservation of genealogical information. Again, welcome, Jose. And if we can start off, if maybe you already have this in your presentation, but to me, the biggest question is what is or what was the Inquisition?
Yeah, and I will definitely get to that, give you some background. In fact, you all can consider this a really basic, high-level introduction to the Inquisition in New Mexico in the 1600s. And so you'll get some of that background as well. But I also want to let you know that as we record this and move this forward here, I'm going to be going pretty quickly. You're not going to have a lot of time to take detailed notes. You might be able to scratch out a couple of notes. But don't worry, because with the recording, you'll be able to come back and you can always pause the recording and get more information. So don't worry about having to scribble things down. But as you go through, if you do have a question or two, jot that question down. My intent is to go until about 10:10 and then to stop and to then ask some questions. You can also, if you don't want to forget the question, you can also type it into the chat if you'd like, and we'll come back and we'll look at those questions there. And then if there's time, I have a couple extra slides that I'll show you. But thank you all very much. As Manuel said, Jose Antonio Esquivel, I've been doing this work for quite a long time. I've been publishing since 1992. I've had something published every year on this subject, every year since 1992. Well over 200 articles, several books, contributions to a number of anthologies. This is my passion, my interest. It's not my full-time job. I have another job. But this is something that makes me so interested in understanding the history. And as I did my own genealogy and got back in time, I realized that my ancestors were the ancestors of many other people. And that's when I decided to start writing about this, because we all share this ancestry, and particularly from the 1600s. Now, many of you may know, and hopefully you do know, that there was a period of time here back in the 70s and 80s and 90s where the main source for us to understand the genealogy of 17th century New Mexico was Angelico Chavez's book, Origins in New Mexico Families. And I don't know how many of you had your copy of that, but it was my go-to copy for research. We are in a different age now, though. We now have the internet. And so many people who start doing their history don't even refer to that book anymore. They simply go to the internet. Now, the internet is a blessing. It really can be very beneficial to access archival documents, to access genealogies, to find other people with shared ancestry that we can share information. But the number one drawback is many times the information is incorrect or it's not cited properly, right? I don't know how many of you have gone down the rabbit hole because you're clicking the line only to discover that it's not correct. So it's really important for us to look for the documentation. And I can tell you that back in the 1990s, when I returned to New Mexico, I'd been living in Iowa for a while when my wife was in graduate school. We returned to New Mexico, and in the mid-1990s, I began to go to the Center for Southwest Research at the University of New Mexico, where they had copies of the Inquisition records. These were records that Fray Angelico Chavez had gone through in order to produce the genealogies that were in his book. And I began looking at those sources that he had and looking for the originals. And not only did I find the records and able to confirm what he had written, I found more information. And that's been the basis of a lot of my life. There's a lot more in this record. So I've been researching these Inquisition records for now almost 30 years. And so I'm going to share with you some of those findings. So let's begin. Let me do a little screen share. And I'm going to give you an example. These are just going to be examples because there are so many records. We just can't go through them. And in fact, any one of these records could take up a good hour or two in terms of a presentation. So let me make sure that the session is up here. Can you all see that? A thumbs up from somebody? Is that up on the screen?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So let's take a look here. So first of all, why are Inquisition records the main source of our family history and genealogy? Why is that the case? Well, the main reason is because of the Pueblo Indian uprising in August of 1600. Because of that event, and it happened so suddenly, and that the families, the Spanish residents, had to flee so quickly with just basically the clothes on their back. They really didn't have the time to gather their belongings, to gather their family papers, or for the people in Santa Fe to gather the archival documents, or for the church friars to gather up the books of baptism, marriages, and burials. None of that could be taken, and they left it, and all of it was pretty much destroyed. So we lost a lot of valuable information in that one event. Records at the local churches were left behind, particularly Santo Domingo, which was the seat of the Franciscan custody. All those church records destroyed. The civil records that would have been last wills and testaments, settlements of estate, the censuses, the land sales, the donations, the grants of encomienda, all the land litigation, all those were preserved or held in a archive room in the Casas Reales de Palacio, the Palace of the Governors. All of that was destroyed and burned. And then, of course, there were the personal family papers that people had in their own homes to verify that they were owners of land, or they had been in lawsuits, or they had dowries, or any other records, wills, you name it, all lost. We lost all of this information. Now, we are fortunate. If you want to understand the kind of records that we lost, just look at the catalog of the archives of Parral. And those are online, and you can see all the kind of records that were lost. So many records were lost. But we are fortunate in that the Inquisition records were preserved because there were copies of these records were sent to Mexico City. And they've been preserved in Mexico City since the 1600s. And they are preserved in the Archivo General de la Nación Mexico. And that might be interesting to us for a couple of reasons. They are not church archives. You think of the Inquisition as being a church institution? No. In Spain, the Inquisition was a government institution. Yes, it had church involvement and it was connected to the church, but you need to remember that the crown of Castilla y Aragon was a theocracy. They were really intertwined with the church, but it was the king or the rulers of Castilla y Aragon who oversaw the church in Spain. The Pope gave them that authority. And so these records are not preserved in church archives, they're preserved in the government archives. And we are fortunate that people in New Mexico began to take an interest in the late 1800s in the history of New Mexico, and were traveling into Mexico, also into Spain, to gather documents related to New Mexico history. The Bandoliers were some of the first to do this. France v. Scholes was the other one who spent a lot of time gathering these records. And they were all then sent and preserved at the University of New Mexico in the Center for Southwest Research. If you've ever been there to do the research, these records are photostat copies. They are bound in red bound volumes on a gallery level, and you can go through and thumb through them. They're right there. But those are the records that Fray Angelico used to compile the genealogies. And I'm going to show you examples of information that he extracted. So a little bit about the Inquisition. Although the Inquisition has a history in Spain going back to the late 1400s, mainly in response to a lot of stigma and violence against the conversos. People, the old Christian families were jealous of the fact that conversos were now able to get into positions of local political authority. They were able to get into positions of church authority, and these families were very jealous of this and would consider and spread false information that conversos were secret Jews, and they instituted this Inquisition in the 1480s, etc. Now, with Mexico City being established in 1519, 1520, the Inquisition didn't officially get established in New Spain and Nueva España until 1565. And it was established not by the church, not by the Pope. It was established by King Don Felipe II. So again, keep this in mind. This is a government institution, not just a church institution. Now, the officials of the Inquisition in Mexico City, the tribunal, was established in 1571, and it existed until 1820. And at least according to what I've read, there are about 38,802 dossiers or case files, and they range from a variety of things, everything from people who wanted a position such as a familiar, an agent of the Inquisition, or they were applying for a position in the Inquisition and they had to show their family genealogy, all the way through to charges of heresy or practicing Judaism or bigamy, you name it, all these offenses. And I'll show you some of those in a minute. To give you a sense of the range of this Inquisition, their jurisdiction across Nueva España, you can see here just how far and wide this institution had authority. And there were agents of the Inquisition in each of these regions that were assigned to oversee the work of the Inquisition in those regions. And that includes New Mexico, which is up in the corner there next to California. It'll be up in the corner up that way. But you can see how far-reaching the Inquisition was. The arm of the Inquisition spread everywhere throughout the northern Spanish Americas. And by the way, this book that I'm citing at the bottom, if you do have an interest in a study of the Inquisition of New Spain, you can come back and copy this down, but it's a worthwhile book to learn about the Inquisition in New Spain. So let's talk a bit about the structure at the higher level. I'm not going to go to the lower levels, but at the higher level, there was a tribunal, Nueva España, that was situated in Mexico City. The Inquisition, these tribunal people were first appointed by the Inquisitor General in Madrid, and those people were connected to the royal crown. There were two inquisitors. They were superior ecclesiastical judges. One was what was called a fiscal, a prosecutor. So these were the main members of the tribunal who would oversee these cases and the trials. But appointed in New Spain by the viceroy were the consultants or the counselors, usually theologians or doctors, or 4 doctors of canon law. There's a position called calificador, and there were 8 of those qualifiers. These were doctors of theology or canon law who examined and weighed the evidence in each case and submitted their results or their opinions to the tribunal. They're the ones that would determine whether the charges against a person went against doctrine and whether indeed these people had violated that doctrine and therefore deserved to be punished, or if they simply just need to be released on their own. At the local level, like in New Mexico, the local level, the royal crown would appoint these commissaries, comisarios. These were the local leading representatives of the Inquisition. They were nominated by the inquisitors, but they were approved by the viceroy and the royal court on behalf of the king, not by the pope. They would then, in their region, say New Mexico, they would receive denunciations. They would publish and proclaim edicts of faith, and I'll share an example of that. They would conduct the initial investigation whenever somebody was denounced, all secretly. Nobody could talk or say why they were, if they came and were denouncing someone, they were told to keep everything secret. They were not to tell anyone that they had spoken to them. They would collect and record these testimonies, and they would prepare communications and reports that were sent to the tribunal in Mexico City. And then, of course, there was the notario, the notary. These in New Mexico were Franciscans. The Franciscan leader of New Mexico was generally the comisario, and then he would appoint another Franciscan to be the notary to record all the testimonies, and he would write all the materials from the investigation and the reports and other communications. So what are the type of offenses that were prosecuted? Mainly heretical propositions, blasphemy, things like saying that there was no Trinity, things like saying there's no spiritual connection between comadres and compadres, that doesn't exist, statements which is contrary to the Catholic doctrine. Blasphemy would be something people could be denounced for. There were superstitions, which we're going to go into because that was many of the cases in New Mexico were around superstitions, mainly related to love magic, to potions, to attracting a man, to repelling, making someone repellent to a man. We'll go through those superstitions in a minute. course, there was Judaism, people who were suspected or tried for practicing the Jewish religion in secret, bigamy, and then also solicitation by clergy. And so there were a number of clergy who were denounced or convicted of affairs with women. Now, something to keep in mind, in New Mexico, there was no Inquisition representative in New Mexico from 1598 to 1625. It just wasn't there. There were some denunciations, but there was no action ever taken by the tribunal. There were no arrests, there were no trials during this period of time. There were threats for people to be denounced, and there were records that were submitted to the tribunal, but there officially was no representation of the Inquisition in New Mexico during this time period. But there were denunciations, and let me just share with you one of the earliest ones. And for many of you here, it maybe take a minute to get yourself oriented, but you're going to see some names here that are actually very common names in our ancestry. One of the earliest, in fact, the earliest case that was submitted to the tribunal was a criminal process against Maria de Zamora. She was the wife of Bartolomé de Montoya. So if you have any Montoyas or even Luceros, this is an ancestor of ours. Ana Ortiz, the wife of Cristóbal Vaca, and Maria de Villafuerte, the wife of Francisco Lopez, their daughter married into the Anaya family. So if you have Montoya, Vaca, or Anaya, these are our ancestors. This complaint, and I'll focus on the one for Maria de Zamora, she was accused of being an hechicera, a bewitcher. And maybe you've read something about this, but this has often been mischaracterized as the witch trial of New Mexico, the witches of New Mexico. And when you really dig into this, that's not quite the case. An hechicera, or hechicero, but hechiceras, these bewitchers were generally women who, I mean, we could think of them sort of as a combination between curanderas, who used potions, made mixes of herbs for women's health issues, but also love magic, where a woman may want to say, I need my husband, he abuses me, I really want him to love me. Can you give me a potion that would help him love me more? Putting together something either in a liquid form or a powder form that the man would ingest and would supposedly then make that man. Or maybe somebody wants to fall in love with a married man and wants that married man not to love his wife, but to love her. Then what's the potion that would make that person fall in love? Or it could even be that if a woman was jealous that her husband was maybe paying too much attention to another man, she wanted to give something to her husband that would make him unattractive to other women. So it's that kind of love magic. But this, she was denounced by her son-in-law. Her son-in-law, Diego Robledo, had believed that she wanted to kill him, and that that her daughter, he had given her daughter a potion that would kill him. And her daughter was 12 years old at the time and married. And so the denunciation was made, and a friar decided to investigate the allegations, and he reported the testimonies. Now, the important thing to remember, people often refer to this as a trial. There was no trial. There was no arrest, no trial. The friar actually thought very highly of Maria de Zamora. He regarded her quite well, and he felt bad that she had been denounced and believed that basically she'd been falsely denounced. There were some pretty wild allegations. If you want to read this thing is available in both transcription and translation. Copy down Cibola Project. If you haven't seen this yet, you can go to Cibola Project. You can find a transcription. I read this document way back when I got it out of the University of New Mexico, but now you can get it typed up, written. You can search the document. It's in English as well as Spanish. And you can see that the friar was pretty pained about this because there were all these wild accusations about her being a witch. And basically, they just seemed to be tall tales. And that's what he told the tribunal. He said, I don't think there's any merit to these at all. But this record has all this information about the genealogy of Maria de Zamora. So this is where we get the information about her background. This is where we learn that she was a native of Mexico City in the Barrio de San Sebastián. She gives her age as 33, so now we know she's born around 1573. She was identified as the wife of Bartolomé de Montoya, and they came to New Mexico in 1598. She identified herself as the daughter of Pedro de Zamora and Agustina Abarca. So this is where we get the name of her parents. And then she said that her father was the alcalde mayor of Oaxaca. That was about when she was about age 7. They had left Mexico City to go to Oaxaca. And I'll come back to that in a minute. Then she says that her family moved to the pueblo de Texcoco, which is right in the area of Mexico and now part of the Mexico City metro area, where they resided in the Barrio de San Lorenzo, and that is where she met and married Bartolome de Montoya. So this is where we get this information about her background. Now, I'll come back to the Oaxaca piece in just a minute. Now, we also learned some information about the Robledo family. And many of you are descendants. This is Catalina Lopez. She's the widow of Pedro Robledo, who died on the trip up here down near Las Cruces. But she came up with her children, her adult children. It's her son, Diego Robledo, who's the husband of Lucia de Zamora. She's only aged 12 or 13, and the daughter, Maria de Zamora. And it's Diego who makes the accusations against his mother-in-law. But there's also mention of Diego's sister, Francisca, married to Juan de Tapia. And then there's also mention of Lucia Lopez Robledo, the wife of Bartolome Romero. And again, these were common ancestors for us. And she's identified as a sister of Diego Robledo. So this one document, we get the genealogies of the Montoya Zamora family and of the Robledo family in New Mexico in the late 1610s. Before I go there, what's interesting about this here is trying to find the ancestors or the genealogy of Pedro de Zamora and Agustina de Abarca. What's curious about this is that the priest did not mention that Maria de Zamora was an Indian woman. And the only way that we discover that she was an Indian woman is in other records of the Inquisition related to her children and grandchildren. We learn that her children were mestizos and her grandchildren were castizos. They were 1/4 Indian, 3/4 Spanish. He regarded her really highly, but nowhere did they mention that she was Indian. And so we have tried first to find the ancestors or the genealogy of Pedro de Zamora, thinking that he was Spanish. But most likely he was the alcalde mayor of the Indian barrio of Oaxaca, not the Spanish community of Oaxaca. So we have more research to do here. And San Sebastian, the barrio San Sebastian in Mexico City, that is an old part of Tonichtitlan, where it was primarily inhabited by indigenous people, was the barrio de San Sebastian. So we have more work to do on this genealogy here. Now, the next record in the Inquisition pertaining to New Mexico is from this period of 1611 to 1617. I put this here because it's less about genealogy. It's more about the history that shaped New Mexico in the 1600s. This is a report of events recorded by Franciscan friar, Francisco Perez Huerta, complaining against the Franciscan leader, Fray Isidro Ordóñez. When Ordóñez came into New Mexico, boy, did he really exceeded his authority. He pushed hard, believing that the crown had made the Franciscans the superior governing authority of New Mexico, not the governors. And he fought the governor about this. He really believed that the crown and that the king had designated New Mexico for the purpose of evangelization, and therefore it should be the Franciscan friars who are the ultimate governing authority in New Mexico. Well, Governor Peralta did not think that was the case. But we start our really early history in New Mexico of these two forces fighting each other. But it wasn't just the church or, the church and the crown. Because keep in mind, Isidro Ordóñez is not only a friar, he's connected to the viceroy, he's connected to the royal court. This is pretty much a conflict of ideology around who should be the ruling authority. And Fray Isidro begins to bring some of the people in his circle, and Peralta begins to bring some of the people in their circle, and it creates this factionalism that we begin to see in this record of the supporters of the Franciscans versus the supporters of the governors. Why I share that with you is because this conflict shaped our family genealogies. It shaped marriages. People who supported the Franciscans tended to intermarry within that group. People who supported the governors tended to intermarry in that group. So our genealogy is very much affected by this type of conflict. You can read the transcription and translation now, also on the Cibola project. It's available there for you to consult. There's a little bit of information about genealogies, but not much. There's a mention of numerous male residents. So this is one of the documents that helps us understand who stayed in New Mexico and who didn't. And if you haven't seen my other videos, just a reminder, out of the 240 men that came to New Mexico in this 1598 and 1600 era, only about 50 remained by 1609. And so trying to understand who those 50 were, can be difficult because there's no census, but we start to get their names in a record like this. But there is a little bit of genealogical information. We learn here that Francisco Madrid was the son-in-law of Alonso Martin Barba. So if you have Madrids in your family, this connection to Alonso Martin Barba is where we get this information. We have references to the brothers Varelas. So again, we get confirmation that these two guys were brothers. And then we have this reference to the relatives and friends of Simón Pérez de Bustillo. All of us should have some connection to A. Pérez de Bustillo. They were the largest clan in the early 1600s in New Mexico. More about them later. So this ongoing conflict between the Franciscan leaders and the governors continued into the 1620s, especially between the next leader of the Franciscans, Fray Esteban de Pareja, sorry about the misspelling there, and Don Juan de Ulate. And it was finally in 1623 that the Inquisition, or the Crown, finally appointed a commissary, a representative of the Inquisition in New Mexico, and that was Fray Alonso de Benavides. He was appointed as the lead custodian, the leader of the Franciscans, and the commissary of the Inquisition in 1623, but he did not arrive in New Mexico until 1625, at the end of December. When he did arrive, he kind of hung out before he came into Santa Fe, and he made this really grand entrance into Santa Fe on January 24th, 1626. He was received formally. There was a whole ceremony of people greeting him, the officials and the people greeting him. And one of the first things he did the very next day is he read the first Edict of Faith in the Villa de Santa Fe. Now, the Edict of Faith, it gets proclaimed from a pulpit, and it tells people, hey, if you're all good Catholics, this is the opportunity for you to come and relieve your conscience of anything you know that anyone has done against the Catholic faith. So if you know anyone who has said something or done something that you believe has gone against the ideology or the doctrine of the Catholic Church, we're going to open this up, and you're going to come and secretly tell us what you know. And so that process gets started in January. It runs through January, February, March for the most part, and then a little bit later too into April and May. And all 44 individuals came forward. Or if they didn't come forward, if someone had denounced somebody and said, oh, so-and-so did such and such with their brother or sister or whatever, they're all guilty of something, we think they're alleged doing something not right, then those people would be called in and asked what they might know about what these accusations are about. So we have 44 individuals. Most of the denunciations were, again, around the use of potions. There was a bunch of love magic. Again, what people were doing. And I do think that, again, the misunderstanding that some of these were remedies. Some of these were things, again, primarily related to women's health, but these were remedies and potions, love magic. Some accusations that somebody, was maybe doing some witchcraft by flying from Santa Fe to Santa Cruz. But again, none of that was proven. It was just accusations. But there were also denunciations against two governors. And so here's where that conflict comes into place again, that the people who support the friars are going against the two governors that were in New Mexico in the 1620s. Again, this is available on transcription, and I think I wrote translation. It might not be translated, but it is transcribed. But here's where we begin to get some really solid genealogy. So if you are descendant of the Gonzalez and Griego families, we begin to get some understanding of this. We have Catalina Bernal, age 15, the wife of Juan Duran. We have Juan Griego, and I underline Pascuala Bernal because this is the only record that we have her name. So you all have her name in your genealogy if you're descendants of the Griego family, but there's only one single record that gives us her name, and this is the one record. The same thing with the Bustillo family. We learned that the Bustillos, Ana Bustillo was married to Pedro Marquez. Her son-in-law was Matias Lopez de Castillo. Simón Pérez gives the name of his father and his mother. This is the only record we have that names Maria de la Cruz as the wife of Juan Pérez de Bustillo. Only one record, and here it is in this spot. We learn a little bit about Catalina de Villanueva, who's married to Juan López Holguín. We've got ages of them there. And then Diego de Vera and his wife, Maria de Avendaño, and she's a granddaughter of Lopez and Villanueva. Now, Benavides made a note here in this year that he knew Diego de Vera, and he knew that he was a nephew of a woman called La Paloma, who had been arrested in the Inquisition in the Canary Islands. And so this is what's going to get Diego de Vera in trouble. And so one of the first cases, in fact, it is the very first case that turned into a trial, because de Vera, it turns out, had been previously married in the Canary Islands. And when he came to the Americas, he was still married. And when he came up into New Mexico, he married a second time. So he admitted to his bigamy. Benavides had known him and his family in the Canary Islands. So there was no way for him to lie his way out of this. So this is the first case that results in a trial. It's pretty brief because he admitted to what he did. He confessed. In the trial, though, he describes his journey to New Mexico, arriving 8 years earlier in 1621. Benavides even copied the marriage records. So this is the only marriage record that we have an image of from the 1620s. He was arrested, taken to Mexico City, and there he was imprisoned. And then he was went to trial, gave his age, said what he did, and he provided his genealogy. He was found guilty, and he was shipped back to the Canary Islands. But many of us are his descendants because he left a couple of children. And so looking at that record, this is the genealogy that we get. Now, you can't write all this down. I do have this on my website, Beyond Origins, if you want to look at there, but we'll leave it here for you to look at in the recording as well. But he gave this detailed account of his siblings. You can see him here with Diego de Vera in bold in the middle with his wife, Maria de Albenano. And you can see that he names his siblings, he names a cousin, he names his parents, he names his aunts and uncles, he names his grandparents. So this is where we get the genealogy of the de Vera family. Notice what's interesting is a lot of times we've spent a lot of times, many people have traveled to the Canary Islands trying to find information on the ancestry of these families. But I want to point out something that people tend to overlook. If you look at the top here, Hernán Martín Vaina, he's a native of Jerez de los Caballeros in Extremadura. In that town in the 1500s, there's a family, a prominent family known as Martín Vaina. I don't think many people have spent time really researching those records. I've been able to find some names, but more research could be done to find his paternal line. But this family has descendants mainly through the Montoya family. You'll see that at the bottom, etc. So this is where we get his genealogy. Rich source of information. Now, a couple other things here, just that Esteban de Pareja, he gets named as the next comisario of the Holy Office of the Inquisition. And he then does the next Edict of Faith in March of 1631. 34 people's testimonies are recorded. People come forth. Notice that it's 26 of these were women. The accusations are mainly related to the use of herbs and potions, love charms, mainly towards abusive or unfaithful husbands to gain the man's attraction, to make a man love a woman, or to fall in love, strengthen his love. Then there was the alleged poisoning of two men, one of them being said to be the lover of Beatriz de los Angeles, and denunciations were made against her daughter, Juana de la Cruz, who was the wife of Juan Griego. Because of these denunciations, we get quite a bit of information about the Griego family. But just to keep in mind, nobody came forward to denounce anyone about sick practices of Judaism. And in fact, Pareja said the people who are raised here since childhood, they're raised with the customs of these Indians without guidance nor schooling. So Pareja saw more influence of Indian customs with the New Mexicans, but there was no denunciations of anyone. And you would think that in a period of time when there was fierce conflict between these two factions, that somebody would at least make a false accusation, but they didn't even make a false accusation. Anyway, there were no arrests, no trials, lots of accusations, but nothing came of it. But we do get this genealogical information, particularly related to the Griego family, because they're the ones that are implicated through Juana de la Cruz, who is the wife of the younger Juan Griego. But we get this information about these folks, and I imagine some of these people are in your genealogy. I have Isabel Bernal in my genealogy. I have Juana Bernal in my genealogy, and Juan Griego in my genealogy as well. So we get that genealogy from there. We also begin to learn about some of the people, and what's interesting is you look at these names, these are all relatives, and they're all part of the Perez de Bustillo family. These people are the ones making accusations against the Griegos. So these are families that supported the Franciscan friars. The Griegos and the Gonzaleses, they supported the governors. And so it was really easy for these people who supported the Franciscans to start denouncing their enemies. But as a result, we learn something about these people and their relationships with each other. This was a large extended family consisting of the Archuletas, the Varelas, the Marques, the Sernas, the Hinojos, and the Vacas. A large family, one of the biggest in the early half of the 1600s. And then there's some more, another bit of denunciations under Perea. Again, more superstitious practices. We get 13 witnesses, accusations, once again, against the Griego de la Cruz family. This is where we get information about Beatriz being an India Mexicana. We learned that Pedro de la Cruz is a mestizo. The Pacheco is a mestizo. We get that kind of information in these records. Now, there's a bit of a lull, and there's not much action taken around the Inquisition until the 1660s. And at this point, this is the one time in New Mexico in the 1600s where we have so many cases that were investigated and were turned into arrests and trials. 7 cases investigated, resulting in the arrest in the spring of 1662. There was the governor, Don Bernardo Lopez de Mendizábal, and his wife. Multiple charges, including practicing Judaism, that came against him. The main reason for this was his conflict with the Franciscan friars. He really came down hard on the Franciscan leadership in New Mexico. He disempowered them. He really made them more than angry. They complained to the point that they were going to abandon New Mexico if they didn't get some results from the viceroy or from the church. And sure enough, they sent this Fray Alonso de Posada to New Mexico, and Posada did not hesitate to go after these folks. Collected all kinds of testimony, and resulting in the arrest of these people, including some of our ancestors. Now, you'll see here that the governor died in prison, so we don't know what the outcome would have been, but he did have a grandfather who had been found guilty of practicing Judaism, but I don't know what the results would have been for his case. His wife, multiple charges, but she was exonerated and released. We have this Captain Nicolas de Aguilar. He did not leave any ancestors in New Mexico that we know of, but he got caught up in this because he was really faithful to the government. And he was the alcalde mayor of Las Salinas on the eastern side of the Manzano Mountains. There were only 10 witnesses that testified against him. 6 of them were friars, 3 residents, 1 former governor. He had 10 charges against him for making heretical statements. He was found guilty. He had a penance in public, and then he was released in 1664. He did not come back to New Mexico. But if you have Anaya in your family, this is where we get the Anaya genealogy. Because Cristobal was a supporter of the governor. He was charged with making heretical statements. He was not charged with Judaism. There were only 9 witnesses that testified against him. 7 of them were friars, 2 were residents. There were 12 charges against him. He was found guilty of some of the charges, but he received a light sentence of doing public penance in the Church of Sandia, and he was released. But we do get his genealogy. And so this is what's really helpful, because he had to share with the tribunal who his parents were. So this is where we learn about his father and where he was buried. This is what we learn about his mother, if she was still alive. Then we get his paternal grandparents. They were natives of Salamanca. He was a captain of the Casa de Moneda, basically the treasury in Mexico City. Here's where we get his maternal grandparents. But what I want to point out is that his maternal grandfather was first named as Francisco Lopez Paredes, native of Spain, of Castilla. But then later, he was identified as Francisco Lopez Pareja. Most people go with Paredes, but he got 2 names in the same record. But we get this background about him where he died outside of Zacatecas, and that she was buried in the church in the Villa de Santa Fe. He identifies his siblings. So again, we get the genealogy. I'm descendant of Francisco de Anaya and Jerónimo de Bustillo. Some of you may be as well, but we get the genealogy. And then we learn about his wife and his children. Unfortunately, these individuals were killed in the August 1680 Pueblo Indian uprising. And then we learn about the Romero family. Captain Diego Romero was charged with making heretical propositions, accused of marrying an Apache woman. This document can be found on the Cibola Project website as well. It's not translated, but you can view it there. There were 27 witnesses that testified against him. 14 were friars, 12 were residents. and a former governor. The fact that he also had 12 residents testifying against him tells me this guy was not very well liked by folks. There were 23 charges against him. He was found guilty of 2 heretical propositions, and for his punishment, he was exiled from New Mexico in 1664. But we get this really valuable genealogy of him. He's also known as Diego Perez Romero because his father was Gaspar Perez from Brussels in what's now Belgium, Flanders. We know his mother was a Romero, and she died in 1643. He had no knowledge about his paternal grandparents, but he had an uncle who had also come to New Spain and had returned to Flanders. But we get all this information about the Romero family. And he said that his grandfather, Bartolome Romero, was a native of a village in the Archbishopric of Toledo, that his mother was a native of Toledo, although another record tells us that she was from Maqueda. They came in the conquest of New Mexico, and they lived in the Villa de Santa Fe, and they were both buried in the parish church. Then he goes into all his aunts and uncles. He starts naming them. He names who his aunts and uncles are, who his cousins are. Look at this first list here, and you'll see what's interesting is that one of his cousins had moved to Sonora. Matias Romero and Isabel de Pedraza are common ancestors for many people, particularly through Felipe Romero, through Catalina Lopez. He goes on, gives more aunts and uncles, including the ones that died as children. So he knew his family genealogy pretty well. And these are his cousins and relatives. This is someone that is in all of our genealogies. Doña Ana Robledo, married to Francisco Gomez. They start the Gomez Robledo family in New Mexico. And then he had his wife, Catalina Zamora, the wife of Pedro Lucero de Godoy and Petronila de Zamora. They had 2 children who died small, so he left no descendants. But in his trial record, he left us this genealogy. And I'm going to conclude here, and then we'll take some questions here with this last one. Francisco Gomez Robledo. This one people maybe have heard of. He was charged with making heretical propositions, and he was charged with practicing Judaism. Now, he is a cousin of Diego Romero. Diego Romero was not charged with Judaism, but this guy was. The number one reason was because his father was Portuguese, and there was a lot of stigma against Portuguese people in the Spanish Americas. There were 18 witnesses that testified in this investigation, 9 friars, 8 residents, a former governor. He had 18 charges against him, and they weren't all related to Judaism. There were other charges. He was exonerated, and he was released. He was not found guilty, and he was released. But again, we get this information from him is the genealogy. And I want to share this with you because there's some interesting information that many people aren't aware of in this genealogy. He names his parents as Francisco Gomez, Doña Ana Robledo, and then he gives the names of all his children. And you can see here that the descendancy of this family is in the 1700s is through the Royval family and the Sandoval family and Lucero de Godoy. But let's go up a little bit. There's mention that Francisco had a brother who was a friar. Not only was he a friar, but he was a commissary of the Inquisition. And then it mentions his father's name and where they were natives of Portugal, Coina, outside of Lisbon. But he had 2 uncles that were part of the Inquisition. One uncle was not named, but he was a counselor of the Inquisition. Another uncle was named, and he was an agent of the Inquisition, a familiar. And then what most people don't realize or know that Ana Robledo, that her father was also an agent of the Inquisition in Toledo. So not only do we get the genealogy, but we have in our ancestry a connection to the Inquisition in the fact that we have ancestors and relatives who were officials of that Inquisition. So I'm going to stop there at this point, or maybe I'll do 2 quick slides. Just as a reminder, these were the families that tended to support the friars. Do you see names that you recognize from your genealogy? The ones that are underlined were the ones that were arrested by governors. So you can see that the governors had it in for the supporters of the Franciscan friars. You can see the ones with asterisks were executed as traitors to the crown for the murder of Governor Rosas. Okay, so these were the supporters there, and we have many of them on that side. On the opposite side, Del Parte del Rey, the royalist, you can see here the family members that are underlined were denounced to the Inquisition by the Franciscans. And then 3 of the 6 Inquisition trials there were the ones that were asterisks. So we have this conflict. I just want to end by saying here that the Inquisition in New Mexico was used as a political tool. It was used as a hammer. It was used as a way for people to get at their enemies. A lot less around truly trying to shake people up in terms of their doctrine, their beliefs in the doctrine, or their proper beliefs in the doctrine, or even trying to root out Judaism. So I'm going to stop there. And let's take a few questions. So Manuel or others, can you help me out here? Are there questions? What do you want to know? What would be helpful to understand? What did I not cover?
First of all, let me,
Priscilla, Priscilla, and
muted?
then I think Marge, you want to say something too?
okay, go.
No? Okay. Priscilla.
Right. So I do know the story about the Alonso Varela's brothers, Pedro and Alonso. Was it Pedro that stayed with the governors, and Alonso went to the
No.
friar, the Catholic?
No.
What was the story there?
Yeah, no, they married into they both remained supporters of the Franciscans. Both of them did.
Okay. Okay.
And you can also determine who the supporters of the Franciscans were in the 1700s by where these families lived. And so the Varela family, Alonso had his estancia where the area of Las Golondrinas, southwest of Santa Fe is. So they lived outside of Santa Fe. Pedro and his family lived by Sandia Pueblo, down in the south. So the families that lived to the south, especially what's now the Albuquerque Bernalillo area, the families that lived there tended to be the supporters of the Franciscans. The supporters of the governors tended to live in Santa Fe or in the Rio Arriba, up north.
So they changed their names though. So one of them went Varela Jaramillo and the other one was Varela de la Sara.
Yes, that's correct. And that's how they distinguished their descendants. Yes, they did. Yeah.
Okay. And I was so, I'm so sorry, but I did understand that the Varela Jaramillos were with the governors and the,
No.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Both of them were staunch supporters of the Franciscans. Now, there were some families that were split, like the Dominguez family. The Dominguez family was split. Their father supported the Franciscan friars. Their brother, Tomé Dominguez de Mendoza, supported the friars. Juan Dominguez and Francisco Dominguez supported the governors. So there were some of that. Luis Martin seems to have been implicated with the friars, but Hernan stayed loyal to the governors. So those two brothers were maybe separate as well.
Okay, and I thought that was the case with the Varela brothers.
And then there was some switching too, because early on, the Chavez family supported the governors, but then we see this switch by the 1630s of the Duran family switching over to supporting the friars. So there were changes in allegiances too.
Interesting.
Yeah. Some other questions? What do you need to know?
I have a comment. Thank you for your presentation, Jose. But just listening to you talking and kind of what I know about the Inquisition is just chilling to kind of make parallels to what's going on today with, how the Christian nationalism is causing this kind of targeting of individuals to secretly, expel from public media, the whole bit. So it's pretty chilling to learn, to see that we haven't really learned much from our history. We kind of keep using the same kinds of tactics to persecute our enemies, quote unquote, as well. So just kind of chilling for me to kind of see the parallels to what's going on today.
Yeah, and certainly in that era, people were trained or learned or had to learn to conform. And if you didn't conform to what the overarching beliefs were,
well, I think that's the same here in this era. We're trying to be beating into conformity. Yeah, especially if you work at a university and all that, if you don't go along with the party line, then you're in danger of losing your job.
Yeah, or being imprisoned now. Yeah, and you can see that in this case, for each of those people that ended up in trial, they had all their belongings confiscated. So we have records of what their belongings were because they had to do an embargo of all their property. But that was an expense for people. When they were in prison, then what would happen is they had to pay the cost of their own imprisonment. So every day went by, there was an official there that would document the cost of food and all these other things that would go against their property. so
Right.
that when they were released, there was also a final accounting of what the cost was, and they were forced to pay that cost for themselves. So you can see how for the Franciscan leadership that was so zealous in New Mexico about their wanting to be the prime authority, that they were willing to basically attempt to bankrupt their enemies,
Yeah.
and force them into that. And I can tell you, Cristobal de Anaya, he was released and came back. He was forced to do penance in Sandia Church. And there's a record from later on because he was not happy about this. And when he went to the church to do penance, he showed up in church in his full military uniform and with his weapons. And you don't go into a church with your weapons. You don't do that. But that's how angry he was. It's like, okay, I'm going to come here and I'm going to do my penance, but I'm going to show you all that I am not happy about having to do this because this is what you did to me. But anyway, so yeah, it's pretty fierce. The conflict that we had in New Mexico between these families, they would even get into fights and injure each other, or they would burn each other's property. And this was not an idyllic community. Keep in mind that at that time period, there's about maybe 70 families. I mean, there's not that many families in New Mexico.
Mhm.
And they are going at it with each other pretty fiercely until almost the 1670s, when things tend to chill out a little bit. Then you start seeing families intermarry outside of each other. But if you look at your genealogies in the early 1600s, you'll see the supporters of the Franciscans tend to intermarry with each other a lot. It's not till the late 1690s that you see these people kind of crossing the line and marrying into, the Hatfields. They're marrying outside their families. So, any other questions or comments?
Yeah, Jose, I have a quick question. First of all, is good to see. I can trace my family back to both the Madrids, Robledo and Juan Gomez, Grego.
Yeah.
My grandma was a Grego, my mom was a Madrid, et cetera, et cetera. So that was good to see. But also, another quick comment is thank you, because I used some of your writings for my book, and you just confirmed and a lot of what I had written and made me feel like, hey, okay, I did it right. But my question is this: you talked a lot about the Jews, first of all, could you explain before we move forward who were the conversos? And there doesn't seem to be any record of Muslim persecution in New Mexico, but I do believe there were some in the area.
Yeah, there's no account of any Muslim activity or even accusations of that in New Mexico. There's no account of that. The conversos. So it was around, for a long time, from like around the 1000s until about the mid 1300s, because Spain had been taken over by the Arabs and pushed the Christians up to the north. Within the Arab communities of most of the Iberian Peninsula, there was tolerance with allowing Jews to be part of the Muslim communities. And so you had Jewish communities settling in the Iberian Peninsula. When the Christians from the north began to take back the land and push the Moors and further south, keep in mind that sometimes people stayed in those towns. They didn't move, they stayed there. And so as the Christians took over the land, there were Muslims or Moors and Jewish folks that decided to stay. And so for a while, there was tolerance among this diversity of having Christians, Jews, and Moors living together as the Spanish retook over the Iberian Peninsula. But by the 1350s, when most of the peninsula had been taken over, there was a lot of conflict occurring with people feeling very jealous about, particularly the Jewish folks and their ability to manage commercial activities really well. They were good supporters of the kings, which is why the crown really supported them in their communities. They were financial supporters of the government. But the folks in the local towns, and particularly the Franciscans, some of the friars, were getting really upset about the prerogatives that were being granted to these folks. And we started to see persecutions, sermons against Jews, persecution, so that in 1391, there was this large forced conversion, either convert or die, leave, convert, or die. And so there was this large forced conversion in 1391. But there wasn't a lot of groundwork put in place to introduce these people into the Catholic faith. And so this is where we get these concerns. Some people converted who were well enough educated, converted wholeheartedly. They understood that conversion. Some just did it and went along with it. It didn't really matter to them. Others decided to practice their Judaism in secret. And so conversos, even though, and some decided just to stay Jews, all conversos got wrapped into anyone who converted was still a Jew from an old Christian mindset. And so in the 1400s, these conversos were now entered into Christian society. They could get positions on city councils. They could get positions, leadership of the clergy in the church. The old Christians became very jealous of them getting into leadership of power, and they began to accuse all of them of being secret Jews. And by the mid 1400s, there's all this conflict between old Christians and the conversos, so that by the 1470s, people truly believed that anyone who had been descendant of conversos was actually a practicing Jew, and so they went after them in terms of the Inquisition. So that's that background. So that goes back to
Thank you.
And there were instances of people who were conversos practicing Judaism in the Spanish Americas. We do have good representatives. It's just we don't have that in New Mexico. There's no Inquisition case that proved that somebody was practicing Judaism in New Mexico in the 1600s. What else do you want to know? We got a few more minutes. Now's the time. What do you need to know?
The Carvajals,
Yes.
what side did they come down on?
The Carvajals were supporters of the Franciscans. That's where they landed. Pretty early on. Through most of the 1600s, they were supporters of the Franciscans. Some others? In fact, one, just so you know, Juan Victoria de Carvajal, one of those edicts of faith that I mentioned, the one from 1631, the grand ceremony, Juan de Victoria Carvajal was selected by Esteban de Faria, by the friar, to carry the banner of the Inquisition into Santa Fe when they did their procession. And the friar thought highly of Juan Victoria de Carvajal. So,
Quick question. Francisco Madrid, they fall on the governor. They supported the governors.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Supported the governors. That's the side they fell on. Supporters of the governors. Now, what's interesting is that's one where he married. I'd have to say that he walked the line diplomatically. I think he wasn't one of the stronger supporters of the governors because he married into the Perez de Bustillo family. So I think he's one of those guys that kind of walked the fine line. Was never denounced to the Inquisition. So same thing with Pedro Lucero de Godoy. He's an interesting guy. He was respected by the friars, and he was a supporter of the governors, but he was never denounced to the Inquisition either. So there are some of these guys that seem to be able to figure out how to balance that between the two sides. But for the most part, more leaning towards the governor's support.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Now, this might seem like a naive question, but I don't see any Martinez's and all of that, and Martinez is a common name.
Yeah, it is. It's Martin Serrano. So the Martin Serranos. And so Luis Martin Serrano, he gets mentioned in the 1640s. He was mentioned as being an accomplice of the supporters of the Franciscans when Governor Rosas was killed. And in fact, it turns out at least one of the records implicates him as someone who was supposed to be executed because of that treason, but he wasn't executed. Now, his brother, Hernan, lived in Santa Fe and tended to be a supporter of the governor there. The Martin Serrano clan, they had the two brothers, one in Santa Fe. Luis lived up in the Chimayo area. And that gives us at least one of the biggest branches of the Martinez family.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Some others? Anything else? Another minute or two?
Well, I have another comment with that. Listening to your presentation, it seemed like there was a fair number of individuals that were indigenous that were being or connected strongly to indigenous ties.
Yeah.
And then the large number of, it seemed like women because they were practicing love potions or whatever.
Yeah.
And of course, I'm not sure what the records say or whatever, but to me, it seems like the suppression of indigenous rights as well as the suppression of women's rights as well.
Well,
Because if it was these potions to try to make men love them more or whatever, what does that mean? What does that suggest that You know, that's just kind of the way I take it. So again,
Yeah.
kind of the parallels to what's going on today.
Yeah, well, and the records do have quite a bit of references to Indian servants, whether male or female, as being influences on this Indian servant gave my mother these herbs and told her how to make whatever. So yes, there's this interaction. The Griego family, which I didn't put in here, but the Griego family in some of those records, they were referred to as actually living at the Pueblo of San Juan. That's where they lived, was the Pueblo San Juan. So there's this interaction. And Pedro de la Cruz and Jerónimo Pacheco were denounced because they had participated in a ceremony in Akiva, and they were denounced for participating in those rites. So yes, I think one thing we have to understand about Spanish New Mexico is that there was this interaction between the local Pueblo Indian culture and the Spanish culture. That doesn't often get mentioned very much in our history books, but they were interacting with each other very closely. And this is why Chavez did not put the racial designations for most of these people. He did not do that. But when you look at these records, people get referred to as mestizo, castiza, some are Espanol, that's fine. But yes, there was this intermixing that is part of our ancestry. And I'm glad that now, because of DNA, more and more people are accepting the fact that they have indigenous ancestry. We might not be able to document it from the records, but we have the genetics. And that's my case. My paternal DNA, Y DNA, goes to Western Europe, goes to the Iberian Peninsula. My maternal DNA is Native American from Central Mexico. So, I can't document that, but I have it in my genes. And I think that's the case for most of us here.
In addition to like African roots as
Yes,
well,
and
like,
some
which should
African.
be the Moors as well.
Yes, and we do have that too. Now, keep in mind that the Indians were exempt from being prosecuted by the Inquisition. So we don't have very much about that from the Inquisition records. So okay. All right.
Hey, Jose, one more last question. I asked you earlier, and I want to grasp the whole idea of the Inquisition. Could you very briefly just talk in general the concept of the Inquisition? I know you've talked a little about the different pieces, but I think maybe how would you describe that?
Yeah, the intent of the Inquisition was to root out and uncover beliefs and actions that were considered to go against Catholic orthodoxy. So that's what it was all about,
And the crown, right?
What's that?
And the crown.
Yeah, well, and it could have been too the crown, but it was mainly around the church. It's like,
yeah,
if you said something like, "I don't believe in the Trinity. There's no such thing as the Trinity," or "I don't believe that godparents are related to each other spiritually. I don't believe in that." I'm going to spit on the. One person was said to have spat on the cross. They spat on the cross. They desecrated the cross. Things like this, or bigamy. If they did something, married more than once was considered a crime. So that was the Inquisition, was going after behaviors and words that were believed to go counter to Catholic teaching. That was the intent, but it doesn't mean that that's what it was used for all the time. So again, you could trap somebody if you wanted to and accuse them. Right?
This is a little.
Keep in mind, these people didn't know. Everyone who got arrested, they did not know the charges against them. Those people that got arrested and transported to Mexico City had no idea what the charges were. They didn't know who denounced them. They had no ability to defend themselves. They were simply taken from New Mexico, put in a prison in Mexico City, and had to wait there to be told what the charges were. They were never told who were the people denouncing them. They were never told that. So that it was all done in secret.
Like deportation program.
In a way, it was. They were. That was like, Laura?
This is a little bit out in left field, but it goes to the Catholic faith. And the fact that I just cannot find who these people were. I have knowledge that some ancestor was in charge of La Conquistadora and her care and her clothing. Can you tell me who that might have been? I just can't find it.
Yeah. For the 1600s, we don't really know. We know that Josefa Lopez Grijalva, we know that she rescued Our Lady at the time of the revolt. We don't, again, those are the records that we lost. We lost those kind of records. We have better information about that in the 1700s. So there is a record of that in the 1700s of who were the mayordomos that cared for this, but probably not until like the 1720s that we have those records. Prior to that, it's very challenging just because the records are so few. And for the 1600s, all that would have been documented somewhere, but it's all lost.
What do you know about the archeletas?
So the archeletas, so the archeletas, Asensio de Archuleta married into the Perez de Bustillo family. And so they were staunch supporters of the Franciscans consistently throughout the 1600s. So, in that respect, they had the one son and they had several daughters, but they pretty much stayed consistent in supporters of the Franciscans.
Mr.
Okay.
Escobar,
Yes.
I just have one. I hear you speak about the Gregos, and that's part of my relatives related to the Trujillos, the Romeros. But I didn't hear anything about the Garcias, and I purchased this little book at the conference.
Yeah.
It was done by Elmer Martinez.
Yeah, no, Elmer.
And the Garcia name was most popular in Spain and Spanish America, but where do we fall in what you just presented?
It depends on several things. So in New Mexico, in the 1600s, the main family was Alonso Garcia. He was a native of Zacatecas, born in the 1620s, I believe. He shows up in New Mexico in the mid 1600s. He was appointed by the governor as the alcalde mayor of the Rio Bajo. So his family tended to be supporters of the governors. His is the Garcia de Noriega family that survived the Pueblo revolt. Now, then when the Spanish returned in 1690, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that period, we get several other Garcias. We get Garcia Jurado. We get Garcia de la Mora. There's probably another Garcia in there. We get several other Garcia families. So I think when you have Garcia, you have to trace back to figure out which of these Garcia folks you belong to. And that depends also where you have your ancestry. If you have your ancestry in the north, you're more likely Garcia de la Mora or Garcia Jurado. If you're in the south, you're more likely Garcia de Noriega. But there were some Noriegas up north, so it depends.
I always knew I was with the cartel. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, really. Yeah, but they come a little bit later and in our history. Okay. Anything
And
else?
then I did want to know if there is a copy of your presentation available.
It only through the recording here. So this recording, my understanding, we'll make the recording and it'll get posted online, and you can come back and view it that way. You can pause it and take notes, etc. Okay.
Thank you so much. You were awesome.
And I do want to emphasize the fact that some of these records are now, you don't have to go to the Albuquerque Library to do this. You don't have to go to Mexico City to do this. The Cibola Project is part of the University of California at Berkeley, and they have scholars who have transcribed these records. They have copies of the records there too. And in some cases, they've done the English translation. So you can take your time, you can search the document in PDF, you can read through it yourself just to get the history of the historical context. It's very fascinating history. And keep in mind, when you do read it, whoever's giving the testimony, if you can put on and decide, wait a minute, I think these are supporters of the Franciscan. Let me read it from that perspective, because chances are they're partisan and they're biased against somebody who's a supporter of a government.
One more question, and then we'll have to move on.
Okay.
Daniel,
I have a question also. Okay, yeah. So Martin and Martinez are used interchangeably. Was there a point where they changed from Martin to Martinez, or are they used together all through the history?
No, they aren't. No, it was Martin Serrano until the early 1700s, and then the families dropped Serrano and became known as Martin. And it was Martin throughout most of the 1700s. It was probably late 1700s and certainly early 1900s that some branches of that family began to use the EZ. An example is in my family. I'm descendant of, on my father's side, descendant of a man named Bernardo Martin, was born at El Potrero there at Chimayo in 1792, and he was known as Bernardo Martin. He settled in Mora when he was an adult. He was part of the Mora land grant in the 1830s. He settled in Mora as an adult. And he was still using the name Martin, but his daughter Viviana Martin, later in life, especially when the U.S. Government came in, was known as Martinez. And so I would say that probably by time New Mexico became a part of the U.S. community, you see this really large shift from Martin to Martinez.
Interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, and I can't say why. Some people say, well, it's Los Martins, we're Los Martinez. I can't tell you why, but you'll have to look at your own records to see when did that branch shift that. And most
some of
likely
those
it's going to be at the time of the American occupation.
Some of those names started out like singular, and then they were added on. Like Sorensen was Soren was the original, and then son of Soren. So maybe something like that.
Yeah, and then you just add these names, and there's so many names that changed over time. You know, Beta becomes a Beta, Tienza becomes a Tencio. You know, there are names that changed over time in New Mexico. You'll see that as well. There's quite a few of those kind of names that changed over time just because that's the way people spoke. So who knows? It could have just been that's the way people spoke, and that's how it got recorded.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Jose. Great presentation. Learned a lot. You're welcome to stay for our business meeting if you'd like, but if you want to watch the Utah game, I understand.
I'll head out, but thank you all very much, and looking forward to seeing the recording. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you very much for speaking. I love that.
Excellent. Thank you, Jose. Thank you very much.
Okay, folks, we're going to continue our recording.